Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of One Vision Fintech Views. This is Barb and Theo, your host for today's episode. Joining us from across the pond, a wonderful friend, previous guest of the show, and one that needs no introduction, Dr. Lita Glyptis. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Two of my favorite people in the world. It's so good to see you. I'm only sad you're not nearby, so I could actually.
Yeah, we need a group hug. We need a
We
group
do.
hug
We do. We
to do
do.
all this. Um, Authors of Bankers Like Us, and congratulations on your second book, Beyond Resilience.
Thank you so much.
And we can see that in the background for those who are actually watching on the video.
Strategically positioned. Strategically positioned.
Yes, you actually need a stack of those. So it sprats in the back, so you can't miss it.
So I actually the author's copies have just arrived, and they're sitting accusingly in boxes across the room. So I need to do that. I need to
Yes.
actually unbox them and position them behind me. I spoke to my publisher recently, and he's like, "You need more copies of the book. Please send them." And of course, he did. And there we are.
Oh, yes, you do. And unboxing is always fun. That feeling of opening the box and getting your copies. Congrats again. So let's talk about your book, because that's why we are all here today. One of the things that jumped out when I was going through it, you talk about heroic CEO. That word is fascinating, both from a startup perspective as well as from a regular corporation enterprise perspective. We worship heroes. We love people that are out there, like, I don't know, those that just work insane hours, the 120 hours people say, and I sleep in the office, all of those. The whole narrative, I rescue and create this thing out from ashes, is worshipped. But your book challenged the heroic CEO narrative and suggests that success, which is a fascinating work. I talked with Liz lately about the word success, what it means. And you say success requires team to, often go to the unheroic ones, the quiet ones, those that are working on building something new. And you wrote, quote, having one will not hurt your chance of success, to be clear, but even if you have one, they're not enough for success. So in your experience, if we look past the narrative of heroic CEO, look for those who are quiet and doing the things behind the scenes. What are some of the critical behind the scenes roles, capabilities that frankly don't get talked about and don't get enough attention?
I'm so glad you picked up on that, because I totally agree with you. We love the heroics, and because we love them, we perpetuate them in big corporates. The people that we speak about are the people who pull rabbits out of hats, not the people who never put the organization in a situation where that needed to be done. We're talking about putting out fires, never talking about the people who create fire resistance in our organizations. And in the startup world, that's even more pronounced, because there is a particular type of personality and persona that we find is favored by journalists, by commentators, by influencers, and by investors. So even when I started the work, people were like, "Oh, are you going to write about?" And then they name dropped two or three of the big name founders who either had amazing exits or are just everyone's darling right now. And my answer was, I hope not. But I don't know yet, because of course I genuinely wanted to challenge my own assumptions. And I didn't find that a heroic CEO or a heroic figure hurts you. As you rightly point out, you can actually do really well with a figure like that. But some of the success stories that I saw had none of that. And there's one piece in the book where Valentina Christensen describes the founders of Oak North, the SME bank here in the UK, as the two most successful people you've never heard of. And I think there is something very, very interesting in that. There are people in the book who, unless you've worked with them, you wouldn't know who they are, and you wouldn't know the fact that they've had 3 successful exits and they're building another business. They're serial entrepreneurs in the most meaningful sense. They built something successful, spun it out, or sold it on, and they're going again to do something different. So to your point, what is the quiet and heroic work? I think there are three elements there that are really important and came through very strongly in the book. One is, when life gives you lemons, let it take the lemons. There is a big piece that the success stories show humility, teachability, responsiveness to data points. And those data points could be feedback and criticism from an early investor or an early user group, or it could be market feedback on your price point. Contrary to the idea of standing strong and sort of taking the punches when the journey is difficult, actually being responsive to feedback and staying the course at the same time is something that is extremely valuable and repeated across the board. The second piece that is that was very common and was not surprising to me was you need to get your boring stuff. I mean, Barb and I talk about plumbing a lot. You need to get the boring operational stuff right. You need to think about your cost to serve, your target addressable market, and your price point really early on. And most of the ventures we see don't, either because they're backed by a big corporate that is driven by some big strategic vision, and don't start looking numbers till they're a fair ways down the road and go, hold on a second, how big is this opportunity? And then you see a lot of ideas change halfway, or because they have a different type of capital. So there's some very unglamorous work around unit economics and cost to serve, and actually working out if the thing you want is wanted by enough people, enough to pay enough for you to have a business. The third piece that came through a lot and actually surprised me more than it should. So you need to be really intentional about spending time on the things that matter to you and your business when you feel that you can afford it the least. And one of the things that came through in the interviews that I found really fascinating was how people spend their time in a way that is both aligned to their values, but also what they're trying to achieve. People like our friend and previous guest to the show, Uday, who was saying that he spends so much time hiring and gives his hires so much time to become fully operational, that because he believes that finding the right people and giving them the right space to fit in and understand how everything fits in is key, that he has had to defend that decision in front of investors. Similarly, the Pismo founding team were talking about how when they started their venture, and these guys have guys and girls, right? They have kids, they have responsibilities, they have bills, and yet they took a year to whiteboard what kind of company they want to be. That feels so uncomfortable, doesn't it? That you're burning through your own savings, you're not using the time to do things that will get you the thing that will get you the investment that will get you across the line. That intentionality in how you spend time, and it's not the same thing for every founder or for every intrapreneur. It's whatever it is that is important to you, your team, and your business. But that intentionality in spending time on things that are important before they're urgent, also not very heroic, but so foundational. And between those things, you see behaviors that are consistent, that do the fundamentals early on, that actually take feedback from the world around them and adjust in ways big and small. All of this is intensely difficult work and requires a lot of resilience, but it doesn't involve standing on top of a hill waving a sword like we often think of as, like, that super heroic CEO standing tall against the world and all of that.
Well, now that I've joined you in the ranks of recovering bankers, I love how you've defined rather pragmatically the art of not dying rather than achieving some perfect end state. And you say not dying doesn't guarantee continued success or survival. Nothing in life does, but it sets you apart from the majority anyway. So when we look across the landscape, especially thinking about startups, but even existing organizations and the high failure rates that the startup ecosystem has, how would you say that you can maintain that balance of resilience when things aren't going the way you wanted, or even if you had some notion of a plan, while also knowing when to actually make a shift or course correct?
It is so hard. And one of the things that I felt most challenged by as I was writing it is that everyone I spoke to was like, well, it's an art, not a science, right? For all the times you will pivot and all the times you won't pivot, you won't know if it was the right thing until after the fact. And that is one of the things that some of the people I interviewed called luck, some of the people chose different terminology, but the reality is there is no blueprint. That's the whole point. That's why this work is so hard. You're doing different things differently for the first time. You're going to have to make some calls on incomplete information. So how do you do that? People pointed to three things that I think are very valuable. And no matter whether you're in a startup, a scale up, a corporate, or actually in a BAU situation, they're really helpful. One is the team you have around you. The people that you have around you that will challenge your assumptions, jump in with you, or tell you you're being an idiot. And actually, that was my favorite question to ask a lot of the founders. Who's telling you you're being an idiot? And I had a couple of people saying, oh, everyone's telling me I'm being an idiot. Like it's literally everyone's job, which I'm not sure I believe, but I do like the sentiment. So are there people around you who will check your blind spots? Is your team configured in such a way that you're not all cookie cutter versions of each other, but you can check each other's blind spot? I think that is one thing. The second thing is, do you have a mentor, advisory board, manager, depending on what your construct is, that can help you? The quote from Christian Nentrich in the book is, help you avoid 2 unforced errors a year, which is actually a very nice metric to have. Is there a voice or set of voices outside the day-to-day pressures that will help you see things that you wouldn't otherwise see? And actually the metric of 2 unforced errors a year is actually is very powerful, because you can see that it doesn't take much. The three thing I would say is, are you putting yourself in a situation to receive feedback? Because one of the things that we see both in big corporates and in startups is that we get sucked into the weeds of the work we do, understandably, so much so that we forget sometimes to validate some assumptions. So are you putting yourself in a situation where real users, real stakeholders, real customers give you some feedback on your product, your process, your pricing? Again, Kelvin Tan gives a very interesting example of how he goes constantly out and speaks to clients and is prepared to come back and flex his operating cost if his price point isn't right, because everything is interconnected. So that humility in having a team that will challenge you, having external advisors or external to your team inside a corporate, a sponsor, a mentor who will challenge your blind spots, and actually putting yourself in a situation where you will get feedback from the market. These things are really vulnerable and difficult things to do, but they do prevent you from falling into some of the most common reasons behind the high failure rates, because you're absolutely right, the failure rates are spectacularly high, but the reasons are really mundane. And I've written about them before, and both of you have spoken about them before, but the reasons are usually exhausting money or headspace, which are currency of different sorts, not taking feedback, and going down rabbit holes that you can't come out of. There's a rabbit in every story.
Rabbit hole. There is a rabbit in every story.
There's a rabbit in every story.
Oh, that's a nice way of weaving Grammy into the conversation. Anyway, so let's continue in another train of thoughts, right? Thinking about starting, thinking about stopping, continuing the mental ability to actually think about what you need to focus on. This is where the question always comes about. Do you focus on long-term impact, doing something that actually creates positive value for someone somehow, somewhere, or short-term profits? These don't always align. And especially in financial services, money is central to everything. Startups, you're constantly under pressure. You need to return the money, have an ROI, positive ROI. The leash is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. What drives successful entrepreneurs to prioritize one over the other?
That is such a good question, because the answer to that is twofold. There's their own sense of mission and purpose. And one of the things that was fascinating for me is that everyone I interviewed talked about impact. How they went about pursuing it was very different, but everyone talked about impact. So the two things that drive them is their own sense of purpose, and the second is the circumstances they create for themselves. Because one of the things that I found very interesting is that there are a group of entrepreneurs that I interviewed in the book who talked about the first and second time they did things where they got it wrong. And actually, they found themselves at odds between the mission they were trying to pursue and the pressures they were under. And the things that those come down to are always around managing currency. And I say managing currency because in a big corporate, the currency you have to manage isn't actually money. It's time and headspace, and it's not a linear usage of time and headspace. If you're doing an ambitious program of work inside a big bank of the likes I know Barb knows really well, you could run out of headspace or sponsorship in really unpredictable ways because of political reasons, because of regulatory reasons, because of a variety of reasons. In a startup, you manage your burn rate. In a big corporate, you manage currency in the space of headspace. So one of the things that could compromise your vision is you don't manage that well. The second thing that can compromise your vision is the realization that whose money you take comes with very clear labels of what happens next. How you set up your governance and your purpose inside an organization, what investors you have around your board table and your cap table is actually a very loaded set of decisions. But the reality is, for the vast majority of entrepreneurs, you don't realize how much of a choice A you have, and B, how much of a choice you're making when you say yes to a term sheet until you've been burned. And there are some stories that really hurt my heart in the book as I was going through the life experiences of the entrepreneurs who were kind enough to share their stories with me, about people who took capital too early, who took too much capital, or who took capital from the type of investor that burned them really badly, either because they pulled them in a direction that was different to where they were going, or because they were just, I mean, there's one case in the book of someone who asked not to be named, who essentially had their own investors use their board packs as R&D for another business, and there's an ongoing court case, which is why they haven't been named. So I think one of the biggest things that as an entrepreneur you don't always realize, especially if you're a first-time entrepreneur, is taking the money isn't just about valuation dilution and how good it looks in a press release. It's also what kind of voices you have around the table. Is it patient capital? Is it impact capital? Is it the sort of investor that will actually see you through for the next X amount, or will they push you for a quick IPO? It's actually pretty clear from the type of business. A VC firm has certain behavioral traits versus a pension fund. So actually, as a founder, you have some choices to make, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have to make them at a time when you don't feel like you have choices, and maybe if you only have one or two term sheets in front of you, you go for the one that gives you the most breathing space. But it comes at a price, and it might be a price you decide to pay. You just need to do it consciously. And again, one of the things that came up again and again is that people make those decisions with their eyes wide open on their second and third rodeo, which is why very often people succeed more or go further the second or third time they're doing it, not because they've learned all the things, but it's almost like a video game that you've played before. You clear the first few levels faster if you know how to play it. And that's what happens. And that's one of the hardest ones. So very long answer to a question. Your impact is going to be compromised or supported by decisions you make very, very early on, when you think all I need to do is get started, so I'll be fine once I get going. No, you won't. It matters who you go on the journey with.
I obviously love that kind of analogy. you know, like there's literally a game controller sitting over my shoulder here, understanding the game mechanics of the game that you're playing. And maybe it's just fundamentally understanding the game that you're playing at all. That helps a great deal through that learning.
Makes sense.
You know, you've brought up some keywords that we see frequently, you know, in the industry, the idea of the contrast of the rock star founder, and that entire narrative. And it sometimes trends into what Theo was talking about earlier on hustle culture and, you know, sleeping in your office and all of those things.
Yep.
And you contrast that against the everyday greatness. And so based on your experience and then all of the interviews that you did for the book, how important would you say is having kind of that dramatic backstory or being the very charismatic visionary person in the lead versus simply having, you know, enough resilience and grit and determination to solve a real problem for someone? Fundamentally, do you think, you know, ordinary people can succeed at extraordinary things?
I really struggled with that question as I was doing the research, as you know, partly because a lot of the people I interviewed actually do have extraordinary origin stories, and they have their metal was forged in circumstances that to me at least seem challenging and difficult and impressive, because it's so easy to be defined by your circumstances, right? And here are people who were absolutely not. And so I personally find that inspiring and impressive. And in fact, the first iteration of my first draft was going dangerously down the heroic messianic thing, and my publisher, actually, much to his credit, called me up and was like, what about ordinary shrubs? Is there no room for the rest of us? Ordinary shrubs, such a good phrase in this work. And then I went back to it and I realized that actually where people get their inspiration and their strength and their metal varies wildly, and people who have had terrible or very impressive origin stories don't always turn out to be great, actually. Like all the great villains in history have pretty impressive origin stories. So I went back again and again to try and work out what I found impressive about it, and this is where I got to. This work is extremely hard. Actually doing things for the first time without a blueprint is a particular type of self-torture. And so a particular type of person is attracted to it. That person doesn't need to have an impressive origin story, although many of them do. But it does take a certain type of personality, a lot of resilience, and a whole host of other traits. But I ended up with the title Beyond Resilience, because although I started off saying there's something very special about these people, actually there's something very special about these people, but it's not where they came from. It's how they managed to build the road as they walk on it. It's how they managed to bounce back. And although resilience is a big piece of the story, actually there's a lot of work underneath that resilience that is unglamorous and methodical and deliberate, that is as essential. Without resilience, you can't do it. Because it is hard. And I think one of the things that I found very humbling in the stories is no matter what the origin story of people, there is a common theme in the fact that when you're building something for the first time, be it as a founder or as a corporate citizen employee, it takes a lot out of you, this work, on a personal level. It really takes a lot out of you. It becomes personal in a way that, frankly, working in finance shouldn't do. Like, everyone from outside finance doesn't expect the degree of emotional investment we bring to this thing. Like, I was speaking to someone back home in Greece who's not in finance, in a country where there isn't a big finance industry. And they're like, why do you guys act like you're Braveheart? You're bankers. I was like, yeah, but we care. We care in a way that is very hard to communicate. But my friend was right. It is counterintuitive. So I think and again, I'm giving a very long answer to your question. Sorry about that. But one of the things that I found fascinating is this work is really hard. It really demands a particular type of mindset that is attracted to solving a problem that is not fully defined, operating against a clock you cannot see, with resources that are being shifted and expectations that are shifting in a market that is shifting all in real time. not everyone is attracted to this work, and that is okay. The people who are attracted to this work are united by the fact that they're attracted to this work more than anything else. And the fact that they have an ability to do the deliberate, patient, visionary work, and immense amounts of resilience, because there's some hard knocks on the journey.
Can I make a guess then? Is that what surprised you the most writing this book, this common thread between, you know, the rock star and the common shrub? Or what surprised you the most as you wrote it?
That surprised me, even though it shouldn't have. The other thing that surprised me was how conditioned I have been by my own journey, right? Like, I've spent a long time in startups, but proportionately I've been in corporate much longer. But even with the sort of 25 years almost of doing things under immense pressure, right? Yeah, the way that that Theo described it, like having no time is such a badge of honor. Being exhausted all the time is a badge of honor. Working like a lunatic and not eating a proper meal is a badge of honor. So I had a visceral reaction of profound discomfort when I was writing the chapter on time, and on the fact that one of the most consistent themes that came through was, you need to be deliberate about how you spend time, and you need to give important things time, and you need to decide what's important to you, and then you need to take time over it. And that has to hold on both the startup level and the corporate level. So I'll give you a corporate example. So I had Bianca Bates, incredible woman, has actually left Cuscal since I interviewed her, but she was the deputy CEO of Cuscal in Australia when I interviewed her. And she talked about being early, being strategy. All right, so actually making some investments, knowing you'll be early, and then waiting the market out. And that made me uncomfortable as well, because I have been in cultures of hustle, hustle, run, run, run. And even though I'm intellectually fully aware that this isn't a good way to operate and strategically it doesn't sound, that was deeply uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable. The other thing that was surprising, but not uncomfortable, it was joyous actually, was how unified everyone was as to the not soft sides of culture. That was terrible English, but you know what I mean. Like, everyone talked about culture, they talked about values, they talked about the good stuff. And then everyone talked about how important it is to fire people and fire them quickly. And I know I sound like Cruella de Vil when I'm like, that was great. But it was great to hear people who have years of experience going, I regret not having acted quickly on removing employees that were not constructive for the team, because that resonated with me a lot. And I was surprised to hear everyone go, that's one lesson I learned the hard way, and I learned it late, and that you can't learn that lesson soon enough.
I'm nodding. I have learned that lesson too the past 2 years, and I regret learning it so late. But voila, older and wiser, as we all are.
Exactly.
Before we end, let's talk about stories that are not told. Because often when we pick up a book and we read the stories of founders, we read the stories that the author choose to put in the book, as important as they are, I often wonder what else get left out. What else are on the cutting room floor of movies, of books? Can we talk a little bit about that? Are there things that you had to remove because you just need to do a volume 3? Or I'm waiting for that, by the way, because you started this one quite a while back.
I know. This has been 2
Right?
years in the making. This has been 2
Exactly.
years in the making. So I'll tell you about the section that almost ended up on the cutting room floor. And that's the section early on in the book with some of the people's incredible origin stories. Some of the stories of people talking about, formative childhood experiences, or like Zor's incredible exit story that I'm not going to give away for anyone who hasn't read the book, because I knew that the tone of that section actually doesn't chime with the rest of the book. I'm starstruck in that section, and it's obvious. Like I'm humbled by the fact that people shared some vulnerable personal stories with me. I am in awe of the ground people have covered, and so the tone of that section is different. But also, it didn't fit in with everything. Like, I'm talking about people's childhood, and then I'm talking about unit economics and operational risk. It just doesn't sit well together. And I'm still nervous about the transition between the first part of the book and the second part of the book, but that section almost ended up on the cutting room floor, because I was like, without it, it's a pretty hard-nosed book about operational matters and like funding and governance. With it, there is a big emotional component that is true to the journeys that we're all on, but it's still uncomfortable. So that piece is definitely it was salvaged from the cutting room floor, and I'm really glad it was salvaged, but it's still nervous. The other piece is that, if you think about it, I did 65 interviews of about 2 hours each. People can say a lot in those 2 hours, and all of it was useful. All of it was interesting. And I had a few themes that I was absolutely hell-bent on exploring, but there were a couple of things, like the concept of time. I wasn't gonna, like, that chapter was not part of my original book plan, because that was not something I had thought of in such a nuanced way that came out through the interviews. But I let the commonalities guide me. So there was actually a lot in there that was uniquely interesting. And if I was doing a volume 3, volume 4, there would definitely be value in going back to people and saying, hey, I had this incredible insight from an interview with Kurt, for instance, that nobody else brought up. But if I asked them, what would their take be? So like, Kurt gave this incredible, and I wish I had more space, to be honest with you. The book could have been 2,000 pages long, about how, as a leader, you don't just have a responsibility to manage the vision and the resources and the delivery, but you have to manage the emotions of everyone on your team, about their wants and needs, even if they're not lofty, like their insecurity about how they fit into the plan, their desire for their career to grow, the fact that if that person has a corner office, you want a corner office too. You have a responsibility to manage that. But where does it fall in the hierarchy of needs? I think there would have been some very interesting insights, but I didn't. So there are a few ideas that are beautifully interesting, but I had to decide not to include everything and allow some of the sort of bulldozery common themes to come through. But I think how you manage complex individual needs through this work, and how do you manage the ordinary shrubs that are doing amazing, never call them that, I guess, is one of the ways you do it. But people who are not, I am not a founder. I don't have some of that in me. I don't want that life. But how do you manage me in your team? I'm not ordinary, but I'm also not that. So I think there is something really interesting about the more nuanced leadership qualities once you're on that journey. How do you bring everyone with you? So there's a lot of stuff that came out in interviews, and you're like, oh my God, that could be a book in its own right. But I had to go with the commonalities across those interviews. So there's definitely nuggets that I will be coming back to again and again, and then maybe there's gonna be a book 3.
Okay, can we get to see you before you do that? Because you were so buried in that you disappeared for a
I
while.
know, it's
Which
true.
is a great thing, because now we get to see the end result of it. Before we let you go, where can we find Beyond Resilience on this side of the pond, Lita?
It's available on the Routledge website and on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, we will include that link in the show notes.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining Barb and myself today. Appreciate you, and look forward to celebrating in person.
Yes, that'd be amazing. Thank
All
you for
right.
having me, guys.
Thank you. And for the rest of our listeners, thank you so much for joining Barb and myself for another episode of One Vision. We'll talk to you next week.